Davos or Westminster?
Davos. If I'm Prime Minister, we will not pull out of international agreements and international law, which is respected the world over.
The leader of the West. And if things are turned around there, I think a lot of soft power can be used to pressure governments here to do the right thing. And I hope that that happens. I know that many of my American friends right now are saying, let's just focus on America. It is America first. We have our schools that are a huge disaster to focus on in fixing. We've got to fix our economy. We've got to fix our borders. We just don't want to look of our borders. But I hope and pray that they look into helping out Europe because I really don't think, I don't know, maybe the clever people, the clever Brits, the clever French, Swedes, that they'll stop running away and come back and run for office and participate and take over and repeal these terrible laws that we have in place and withdraw from these terrible treaties. The Geneva Convention of 1951, it's not the way it's abused now. It's become really a system of generating slaves. It's a lot of people. It's modern slavery when you read about it. It's large numbers of people in the developing world, in the third world, who are lured, who think that through the asylum system, they can come to the West and lead economically happy lives. And they don't realize on the way that they are abused, that their money is taken away from them from, drug traffickers, people smugglers, prostitution rings. And then when they come here, they get worked, put to work without any payment because they're illegals. And you just see a very handful of them in these hotels and asylum seeker centers, but large numbers of those people, you don't know what's going on with them, and it's not pretty, and it's happening right here in the countries that invented human rights. And so the Geneva Convention has to be completely revised and I think nationalized. Every single country has to decide to have its own asylum laws that it can control and that jives with its own, national interests. And then for Europe, it's the ECHR. Britain withdrew from the European Union, but it's still party to the ECHR. And so you have people here that commit crimes that you can't deport. And I think the only way to change things around is for everyone now, especially the middle classes, to start taking part in this as it's going to ruin their societies.
Do you think we should deport immigrant criminals?
I think we should deport immigrant criminals. Deportation, I think, is one of the most, if not the most, effective deterrent. Think about it. If you come from, Syria, Iraq, or even Senegal and Somalia, you have paid, you had to have money sent to you from relatives from abroad, or you've sold something precious to give to a smuggler to get you to come all this way. And then once you're here, you commit crimes and you get away with them because of the ECHR laws that the criminal doesn't even understand and treaties he doesn't understand. They probably think it is the hand of God that's keeping them here. And so what you do is the deterrent, and a deterrent is not just, it doesn't apply to the perpetrator you're dealing with at that moment. It's also the buzz that gets out all over, reverberates all over the world through social media and online that says, hey, if you commit this crime, you're going to be deported because so-and-so was deported and so-and-so was deported. That becomes the buzz. Right now, the buzz is you can do whatever you want. You can rape, you can steal, you can burglarize. They'll give you 2 weeks of community service, or they'll send you to a prison that's relatively comfortable with a television and hot water and great food, and you can exercise, and then you can come out of that and you can do it all over again. That's the buzz.
And it's no deterrent, and it means when we don't have that
it's not a deterrent, it's the opposite. It's an invitation to crime. It's an invitation to do awful things. This is why I don't understand some of the policies of these governments, is that if the governments quit demonizing the people who talk about the problems and would themselves do what they ought to be doing, they're going to see that a lot of these solutions are actually not that complex. It's just a matter of applying them. It's standing up to the bullies, standing up to the perpetrators of these crimes. It's really making a selection of who you want in the country and who you don't want in the country. And those you don't want in the country, you get them out.
Davos or Westminster?
Davos. If I'm Prime Minister, we will not pull out of international agreements and international law, which is respected the world over.
Just going back to the Tory leadership election, one of the big issues was the ECHR, and that's something that you think we should leave. You've been very clear about that. Actually, one of the things that I found, you mentioned a piece I wrote a couple of weeks ago, is that when you look at the statistics, there are hundreds of thousands of people here who have applied for asylum, who have been rejected by the Home Office, And yet they're still here. I think only something like 10% of people who have been rejected by the Home Office have been returned. Why has that happened? Because it's dropped off massively. I think in 2013 it was something like 62% of people who failed in their asylum claims were returned. What's happened?
In a few words, barriers to removal. So what happens, and I studied this issue in depth as Home Secretary, and we actually did increase the number of removals while I was there, but still by no means enough. When the way the process goes is, say someone's overstayed their visa, so they're here illegally, or say they've come here illegally in the first place, so they have no basis to stay here, and the Home Office deems that they should be removed. We'll start the process of issuing the various notices to potentially detain them and then remove them. The minute we do that, we'll get hit with legal claims by the person in question, the claimant. And they will have an army of lawyers, publicly funded, by the way, who will put in legal claims, i.e. barriers to removal. Now, those claims are made up of a plethora of kind of bases. Human rights claims are very, very common. They'll claim to be a refugee, so in fear of persecution if they go back to their country. Modern slavery. A very big example of unintended consequences. That started off as a piece of legislation that the Conservative government introduced because we were being compassionate and wanted to protect victims of modern slavery. It's now become a charter for illegal migrants. Pretty much or a large number of illegal migrants will claim modern slavery. And the minute they claim modern slavery, that triggers an investigation and various levels of provision of support from the state. And they can appeal these decisions if they're refused, and they can appeal and appeal. They can judicially review. They can ask for a reconsideration. And there's a whole marketplace of legal claims and a whole industry set up to enable people to put in legal claims and thereby delay and ultimately prevent their removal from the territory. And we're not alone in dealing with that.
No.
France only deports about 10% of the people it seems it wants to remove from its territory. Italy, only about 20% of the people that they want to remove actually get deported. This is a challenge faced by many countries.
Well, this is one of the things I wanted to ask you about, because I think it almost seems like wanting to leave the ECHR is jumping the gun. There are now kind of, all the major European countries recognise this issue. Would it not make more sense to go to the other signatories and say, let's renegotiate this, let's set up a new convention for the 21st century rather than leaving the ECHR?
That's a nice idea, but with respect, I think it's naive. We tried reform, under the Cameron government. There was an attempt to renegotiate, and we came up with the Brighton Declaration under Ken Clarke. Didn't achieve much. There's been Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister going up to Helsinki, I think it was, and speaking to the Council of Europe, urging reform. Nothing came from that. So I think calls for reform of the convention are misguided and just another waste of time. I'll tell you why. There are 46 signatories. We couldn't even get agreement when we were members of the EU with 27 other countries. How on earth would we ever begin to get meaningful reform to what would be a contentious issue amongst 46 signatory countries? So I think it's impossible. And I think that we have talked about reform. We've danced around the issue of reform. We've tried it out for a decade. We've tried that reasonable, in quotes, approach. It has not worked. And the reason it's not worked is there's absolutely no political will amongst the other European countries to engage in that kind of process. So there might be lip service issued to the United Kingdom, but in reality, it won't lead anywhere. And so I'm afraid it's not a decision, it's not a position I've come to lightly, but it's on the back of harsh experience of being a lawyer, being Attorney General, working in the UK government, trying to control our borders. The only option really, if we want a clean and honest approach to our human rights system, is to leave the European Convention of Human Rights. It is, when I say that's not the end of the story, that is not, I think you say it's not a silver bullet. In itself, it's not the silver bullet, but it's shorthand for the beginning of a solution. We need to leave the courts, the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights based in Strasbourg that is attached to that applies the European Convention. So we have to leave the convention. We need to scrap the Human Rights Act, which is our domestic legislation, which incorporates or brings rights home, which is an exacerbating factor which makes this problem worse. We need to reform our judicial review arrangements because we've got a very expansive regime when it comes to administrative law, which again ties the hands of the government, undermining our ability to control our borders. We need to look at other international law. So there's a whole scope of work that needs to be done, and it needs to start with leaving the European Convention on Human Rights. Without that, everything else is meaningless.
On judicial review, I think there's a kind of it's certainly something I was struck by at the time, and I think it was while you were Attorney General, was that the Home Office came up with a policy of pushbacks in the Channel, and what happened was the union attached to Border Force took the government to judicial review. I think the Navy also said that they wouldn't carry out the policy. I think whatever you think of the policy of pushbacks, that to most people seems like a very strange situation where, an enforcement arm of the state is able to take the government to court for asking it to do something.
I agree. I mean, that's more a symptom of the broader problem, which is that we're vulnerable. We're vulnerable to an interventionist, politicised and expansionist supranational court, namely the European Court of Human Rights. And there's a whole body of jurisprudence, case law, that's emanated from that court, which influences our policy, which influences our lawmaking, and ultimately binds us and ties our hands. Pushbacks, let's take the issue of pushbacks, regardless of what you think about the merits of it. The Hirsi-Jammer case of a few years ago against Italy, that's the seminal case from the Court of Human Rights, which ruled against Italy and said that pushbacks are a violation of human rights. So actually, it would be very hard for us to legitimately do pushbacks on the Channel in light of that judgment. And there's a whole other plethora of international law that makes it difficult on the Channel. And the Channel's not the Mediterranean, I agree, but there are differences. So, we can't deport. The simple fact comes down. There are two main reasons why we need to leave the European Convention. Firstly, because of principle. It offends and undermines the cornerstone principle of our democracy, namely parliamentary supremacy. We've got a supranational court in the form of the Strasbourg Court, issues judgments, and no act of parliament can disobey those judgments. And that's at odds with our culture of parliamentary supremacy. The operation of the court is, as I said, politicised and interventionist, such that it's now become a policy-making court, intervening and intruding upon the executive decision-making power of democratically elected governments. And we've seen that in a whole range of areas. So I think the principle of our membership of the court is at odds with these post-Brexit years, with the call for sovereignty and autonomy and to take back control of our laws. The second big reason is the practice of the court and the impact on our policy. So when it comes to migration and border control, it's the court's jurisprudence which has fatally undermined our ability to control our borders and stop the boats and return foreign paedophiles and terrorists and properly control our immigration policy. And some other policy areas are totally affected by the application of the European Convention.
It isn't just the ECHR. So when the Supreme Court ruled that Rwanda was unlawful, I think they said that that it also breached the UN Refugee Convention, the UN Convention Against Torture, the UN International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. I mean, if you're talking about returning parliamentary sovereignty, there are a whole lot kind of more agreements that we're going to have to step outside of.
Yeah, that's why I say leaving the ECHR as a starting point. So we'd have to legislate to limit some of the damaging effects of other customary international law and other international law contained, for example, in the Refugee Convention, some of the conventions you talk about. So it doesn't end with the European Convention of Human Rights, but that is the big starting point without which we won't make any progress. You talk about the Rwanda flights. The Rwanda saga provides a very good case study of, again, why we need to leave. At the beginning of that episode, the flights were originally grounded because of Rule 39 orders. Now, to me, they're an egregious example of Strasbourg overreach.
Can you just tell us what those are? Sorry.
Right. So what happened was previous Home Secretary, under Boris Johnson's premiership, we had the flights ready on the tarmac. And they'd made an agreement within their prerogative powers with Rwanda to remove illegal migrants from the UK to Rwanda. The passengers, illegal migrants, people who had been identified for removal, were on the plane ready for removal. Some of these claimants, as you would expect, challenged the decision to remove. They went to the English courts, they went to the High Court, they went to the Court of Appeal, they went to the Supreme Court. All three levels of English judiciary ruled in favour of the UK government, deeming Rwanda to be safe, deeming it to be a proper and lawful exercise of government powers. They then, at the 11th hour, appealed the final decision to the European Court of Human Rights, and pursuant to an opaque process at which the UK government wasn't represented, a decision made by an unknown judge was made to block the flights. And the power that unknown judge used, or the legal basis that they used, was the Rule 39 order, so an interim order, an interlocutory relief or order to stop the flights pending, the broader and more detailed legal action. The problem with that, and many serious lawyers, former judges have come out expressing deep concern about the legitimacy of that decision, is that the Rule 39 order appears nowhere in the text of the European Convention of Human Rights. It's been a rule that's been made up by the court of its own accord. And that, to me, exemplifies the real problem of the expansionism that this court applies. It makes up rules as it goes along. No state has signed up to Rule 39 orders. No one has agreed to be subject to such a broad range of powers. And there's a serious legal debate about the binding nature of those Rule 39 orders. And many serious lawyers, Professor Richard Eakins, Jonathan Sumption, would say that they are not binding. So there was a real, that's a great example of the overreach of the court and the use of illegitimate powers to undermine a democratically elected government's authority.
So let's say the UK had decided, okay, we never signed up to this, to Rule 39. We're just going to ignore it, because we're not a signatory to it. What's the process then? What happens at that point?
Well, we didn't. So the UK government took the view that they were binding.
Yeah.
And that was really the fatal blow to the Rwanda policy, because then it was all kind of abruptly paused. We then had to go through legal action. The UK government won in the High Court on the merits. Rwanda was deemed to be safe by the first instance judge. That judgment was reversed at the Court of Appeal, and ultimately the Supreme Court ruled against the UK government, deeming Rwanda not to be safe. I disagree with that outcome, but that was the process. I believe that, interpretations of the European Convention of Human Rights via the jurisprudence of the Strasbourg Court operated in a way to stymie our ability to send people to Rwanda.
What do you make of the fact that Donald Trump has indicated that he might want to adopt the Rwanda policy?
I ultimately believe in the kind of value of the Rwanda policy. I think that it was the right policy. I think that it provides the necessary deterrent. It means that the people who come here are still treated humanely because they are going to a country which will provide them with security, accommodation, livelihood, safety, and at the same time allowing us to deal with the influx of illegal migrants. So I think it is the right policy. It's a disappointment that the Labour government has scrapped it such a gung-ho way. And I'm not surprised that other countries are looking at it. I mean, I spoke to a lot of interior ministers when I was Home Secretary who were very interested in adopting a similar model. Italy's done something similar, but not quite the same. They are offshore. They're processing offshore in Albania, but the migrants could still come back to Albania. Interestingly, the European courts and human rights have blocked that policy at the moment. So they've been challenged in court on ECHR grounds. So the policy is actually on pause in Italy. Interesting development. But of course, I'm not surprised that someone like Donald Trump, who's taking a robust approach to border control,
would you advise him if he asked for your help?
Oh gosh, listen, I'm on the record as being someone who would have voted for Donald Trump had I had the chance. Maybe at odds with The Spectator
I don't know. We're a
spectator here and
multiplicity
the
of a multiplicity
editorial
of views.
team here. But listen, I think that I've been clear about my support from across the pond for Donald Trump. I think that he represents a new start, robust borders, a growing economy, and a robust stance on foreign policy.
Davos or Westminster?
Davos.